Hi, my friends, and welcome to Master of Horror, where I give you the scariest paranormal true stories that I've ever come by. Dive deep with me into the depths of the unknown. True, scary, paranormal story number 1, The Entity in the Doorway. When I was about 19 years old, I went to visit my girlfriend Valerie. One night, it actually got pretty late, around 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock a.m. So that's when her parents decided to let me spend the night, but only if we promised not to lock the bedroom door, since we weren't married yet. She lived in a 2-bedroom, small, older house. There was a hallway in between both rooms with the restroom in the middle. We got ready to go to sleep, and I made my bed on the floor while Val was going to sleep in her own bed. I was laying on the floor right next to Val, with my head about a foot away from the bedroom door. After we pillow talked for about an hour, I noticed that she started to fall asleep. That's when I decided to go to sleep, and I began to slowly doze off. That's when I heard someone walking in the hallway towards the bedroom we were sleeping in. It was pitch dark in the room. They didn't have carpet in the room. Rather, it was wood panel floors, so I could hear the floor creaking. I figured it must be her parents checking to make sure we were not sleeping in the same bed together. Then the doorknob slowly turned and the door opened with a creaking noise. I kept my eyes closed, hoping that her parents would leave once they saw that I was asleep on the floor. I was surprised when the door stayed open. Whoever it was, or whatever it was only inches away from my head. I was beginning to get worried and confused because whoever it was not leaving the doorway. I felt as if I was being watched. When 10 minutes passed, that's when I could no longer fake my sleep. I was beginning to truly get scared. Then something happened that I will never forget till this day. I heard a low, long growl. I could feel my heart beating through my body. The room got extremely cold at that moment. Then finally, after about 15 minutes of torture, the bedroom door slowly shut. It took me about an hour or so just to fall asleep. The following morning, I asked Valerie's parents if they checked on us the previous night, and they said they never left their bedroom. That's when I got goosebumps all over my body, and I knew it was something paranormal. To this very day, I cannot explain what happened that night, and what made that growl, and what was it doing the whole time it was standing in the doorway. Scary, true, paranormal story number 2, Chased by a UFO. In 1965, me and my father were coming home from our Wednesday church service. We were driving down a long stretch of road. We were headed to our house in the country area. It was about 10 o'clock p.m. We were pretty tired and were just trying to make it home. While we were driving, I happened to look up and noticed a flickering red and yellow light in the sky. I looked harder, and that's when I noticed it was slowly moving. It was about 2 miles away or so. I showed my dad, and he gazed up at it, and we were wondering what it could be. I told him it looked like a UFO. That's when it quickly vanished. But about 5 minutes later, while we were driving on the same road, we noticed the same light flickering, but this time it was in the middle of the road. I couldn't believe my eyes what I was seeing. It was just sitting there. As we drove closer, our jaws dropped in amazement because it was clear to us that it was an actual UFO. A real UFO with the brightest lights I've ever seen, circling around the spacecraft. We were parked there in front of the UFO, not moving at all. I told my dad, what do we do? Because it was literally blocking us from getting to our house. After sitting there for a couple of minutes and not saying anything, my father did the unthinkable, something that I will never forget to this day. He slammed on the gas straight towards the UFO. The car went full throttle and drove straight towards a spacecraft that was just sitting there in the middle of the road. I thought we were going to crash and die. Just seconds before hitting the UFO, it launched up in the air and took off. I do not know why my dad did what he did. The truth is, we could have literally died that night. As we were racing home and were almost about 2 minutes away from our house, we noticed the same UFO popped up right behind us and was following us. Then it took off in front of us and left us behind. As soon as we made it home, we noticed the UFO was hovering right above our house. We were wondering, how did the UFO know that we lived there? Even though we lived in the country, there were other houses in the area. My dad told me to stay in the car. As he got out of the car, he slammed the door and ran into the house to get his gun. I was petrified as I was staring up at the UFO. While my dad was inside the house, I rolled down my window and I looked around, and that's when I saw 3 or 4 human-like creatures standing around the bushes that surrounded our house. My father came outside with his rifle and started shooting at the UFO. That's when I got out of the car and told him that there were creatures around the bushes that surrounded our house. While my father was still shooting at the UFO, it flew directly up into the air and vanished. We rushed inside and locked the doors. My father called the sheriff's department to tell them what had just happened that night. But that same night, we had to make a statement on what happened regarding the UFO. To this day, I do not know why the UFO chose to mess with us. At night, I always wonder, what if those creatures would have gotten a hold of us? Or what if the UFO would have actually attacked us? This I may never ever know. Scary True Paranormal Story number 3. The Club. This story is one of my own, and it is a very scary, true story. My dad told me this a long time ago, and this story has never left my mind, as it is one of the scariest things I have ever heard. This took place in Corpus Christi, Texas in the 1950s. My dad said his dad, my grandpa, played accordion as a side job and was pretty good at it. He was outside his house playing the accordion around evening time when a man came by and introduced himself as John. He said he was in a band and played nightly at a nightclub in Corpus Christi. He said that my grandfather played really good accordion music and it sounded really nice. He wanted to know if my grandpa wanted to come out to the nightclub the following night and that he would also get paid for it. My grandfather was really excited about the job offer and agreed to it right away. The man told him to make sure he's there at 2 a.m. sharp. My grandfather found it pretty strange that he had to be there at the club so late, but he didn't ask any questions. The following night, my grandfather showed up to the dance hall exactly at 2 a.m. He was dressed really nice and had his accordion strapped around him. He said that as soon as he walked into the nightclub, he felt a strange, weird feeling as if everyone was looking at him. Everyone was dressed in suits and tuxedos. Music was playing and everyone was drinking and having a really good time dancing. He made his way to the side of the stage, and there he saw John, the man that invited him to come to the club. John saw my grandfather and walked up to him and asked him if he knew what song they were playing at the moment. My grandfather said yes, he did know the song and knew how to play it. So my grandfather got on stage and began to play his accordion. But he said about after 2 minutes of playing the song, he noticed that something didn't look right with John, the singer that was on stage at the time. He looked down at John's feet while he was singing, and to his shock and horror, John had goat feet. After seeing this, his whole body went cold. He quickly looked at the other band members and noticed that they had chicken feet. He stopped playing the accordion and looked around at the people dancing, and they all had animal feet and legs. Some people had goat feet, while others had chicken and pig feet. My grandfather was petrified. He couldn't move. Just then, he said the music stopped and everyone noticed that he knew how they looked. Everyone stopped dancing and they all stopped moving. They all looked at him with straight, serious faces. That's when he jumped off the stage and ran towards the door. He said he could hear everyone laughing at him. He finally made it out of the dance hall and ran all the way straight home. When he got home, he told my grandmother everything that had happened to him. The following morning, he went back to the club with some friends to show them where all this took place, and to his surprise and horror, the doors and windows were boarded up. The place looked run down and was falling apart. My grandfather was confused. He later found out that there was a fire years prior that burned down the dance hall, taking the lives of everyone that was there that dreadful night.
The House of Nightmares.
I grew up with my parents separated. I would have to go back and forth between my mom and dad's house. My mom lived in a small town in Texas. It was a 2-story house. My dad was super sick, so my twin brother and I went to go stay with my mother until he recovered. I didn't have a bedroom of my own. My brother Thomas and I had to share a room upstairs with my half-brother Danny. My mom and stepfather stayed in the master bedroom down the hall. Rather than share a room with my brothers, I decided to sleep downstairs on the living room couch. This is where things began to get really scary and creepy. One night during the summer, we got home late. Everyone was getting ready for bed, and I settled down on the couch, and I waited for everyone to go into their rooms so I could finally get some rest. I eventually dozed off. All I remember is I woke up in the middle of the night, and it felt like I was being pulled up from the couch. Panic took over, and I tried to move, but my body was paralyzed as if a heavy weight was on top of my chest. As I struggled in vain, a cold hand covered my mouth, and I couldn't breathe. I felt myself slipping away. Suddenly, the weight lifted, and I shot up off the couch and took a deep, gasping breath. After composing myself, I began to cry until I fell back to sleep. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. For all I knew, it was just a violent nightmare. Now, fast forward a few months later, and there was a really bad storm going on. I was listening to the rain hit the AC unit outside the living room. It was about 2:30 in the morning, and I was beginning to drift off to sleep. From my position on the couch, I could see the kitchen. There was a small sunroom with our washer and dryer next to the back door. As my eyes adjusted to the dark, I could see something darting back and forth quickly between the kitchen and the sunroom. It was a dark mass that almost resembled a human, but it had a transparent body. It was quickly pacing between the sunroom and the kitchen. In complete horror and shock, I remember laying there as still as a statue, watching this thing go back and forth. I slowly pulled the covers up to the bridge of my nose, terrified to take my eyes off the figure. A couple of minutes go by, and it just vanishes into thin air. To get to the stairwell from downstairs, you have to go through the kitchen, and even with that thing being gone, I wasn't going to take any chances of trying to go up the stairs and wake up my mom. I ended up pulling the covers completely over my head and fell back to sleep. The next morning, I questioned everyone in the house if they were awake the night before walking around downstairs. My mother just shrugged it off and assumed that I had a really bad nightmare. Not much happened after that. However, my mother ended up passing away, but my father was still sick at the time, so Thomas and I had to stay with my grandmother for the time being. After my mother's funeral, we moved from Texas to Iowa to stay with my aunt. As if the story couldn't get any more tragic, My dad succumbed to his illness and passed away as well. My stepdad was still living in the same house, and we would go see him from time to time. When we would come visit, these strange occurrences began happening all over again. Maybe it was just me, but for some reason, the house seemed darker than ever. It felt like something was constantly watching me. We stayed the night with my stepfather during Christmas vacation. Before my mom passed away, she bought this nice, soft chair. It was very comfortable, and I slept in it the first night back. My brother and stepdad stayed awake playing cards all night. While I was asleep in the chair, I was awoken by Thomas. He kept shaking me. I asked him, "What's the matter?" His eyes were huge, and his face was completely pale. He said, "Rachel, listen. While I was getting ready to sleep, I looked over and I saw your hair. It was floating up in the air as if somebody was holding it and braiding it." After he said this, I quickly felt my hair, and I got chills from head to toe. I got off the chair and ran to the other side of the room. I looked in the mirror, and half of the front of my hair was braided. I shared the couch with my brother that night, but I still couldn't sleep all night. A couple of weeks later, we went back to visit my stepdad and uncle, and they were cleaning up the front yard. They found one of my old teddy bears buried under some leaves, and they decided to wash it up and give it back to me because the bear was a gift from my mother. She bought it for me many years ago. I was so happy to have it back, even though the buttons didn't work anymore. I would still press the main button multiple times a day, hoping and praying that it would work again. One day, my stepdad, Joe, took us back to my grandma's house. When we got there, he opened the trunk to grab our bags. That's when the bear activated and began playing its little original tune. The tune started off with its original slow tune. However, as it went on, it became a distorted, drowning sound. It slowed down and then eventually stopped. It was creepy, but I brushed it off thinking that it was just the old damaged wiring. However, the bear would turn on and off for the rest of the night, playing the same drowning tune. Now, what I'm about to tell you, in my opinion, is the most haunting thing that can happen to a human being. During the early morning hours, I was laying in my bed when I was awoken by a crackling voice coming from my teddy bear. To my horror and surprise, it said my name, Rachel. It was on the floor near the feet of my bed. I could not see it. I could only hear it. I waited, hoping that nothing else would happen. That's when I felt something slowly get on my bed. I quickly looked at the spot near my feet, and nothing was there. Yet I could see the imprints of a pair of small, childlike feet. I pulled my legs back. It just stood there at the end of my bed. I balled up and began crying and praying for it to go away. I then felt it leap off the bed, and 3 seconds later, my door opened. I don't know who opened my door. That morning when I got up, I tossed it into the garbage. My stepfather ended up being deported back to Europe, and we never returned to that house again. The house was eventually torn down years later. I was happy to see it go. I really wish I could forget about that haunted house and bury it in the past and move on with my life, but it will forever live on in my nightmares.
The aggressive entity.
This happened back in 2007. I was around 9 years old. I had never really experienced anything that can be considered paranormal in my house, but on one lonely night, that would all change. It was around midnight when I happened to wake up as usual. My bedroom door was open with the hallway light turned on. When I turned over and opened my eyes, I saw something. It was a dark, faceless figure looming in the corner of my room. I didn't know what to think or do. Upon seeing this, I was more curious than anything, trying to figure out what it wanted. The tall figure continued to linger around and just stared at me. Looking back, I can honestly say that I wasn't experiencing sleep paralysis. This seemed far too real to even be a dream. I decided to slowly turn around and face the wall. I just covered myself up with a blanket and closed my eyes. The next morning, I decided not to tell my parents about the dark figure. They were extremely religious, and honestly, I didn't want to scare them. After a while, I ended up telling my mom about it. Luckily, she took it pretty well. Instead of flipping out on me, she told me she had also witnessed something similar. But her encounter was much more disturbing than mine. According to her, a tall dark figure also appeared to her in the middle of the night. She tried to wake up my father, but he remained asleep. Suddenly, the tall dark figure moved in and began to choke her. She began to pray out loud, and the dark figure eventually loosened its grip and backed away. It then disappeared. It was only after that it was gone, and my father woke up. I think the entity also attacked me as well, but in a different way, because ever since I had that encounter, scary things have happened to me over the years. I am now 23 years old, and I still live in that same haunted hell house. Thankfully, I have never experienced anything like that ever since, and I can only speculate as to what the dark, tall figure was and what its intentions really were.
The new house.
I'll start off by saying that I don't live with my family. I'm currently renting a house a half a mile away from them. My mom and my brother live in a subdivision, and my dad is currently working abroad. My brother has a mental disorder, which can make him unpredictable sometimes, and he's still in high school, which also further complicates things. Last year, when my family moved into that house, my mother began experiencing unnatural paranormal things. Before she moved in, she decided to visit and clean up the house with two of her acquaintances. While they were there cleaning up, they found these weird red triangle pentagrams under the rugs. At first, they forgot about it, but my mother suspected that something wasn't quite right. When the pentagrams were removed, she had this inexplicable feeling that they were making a huge mistake. At that exact moment, when they were removed, the ceiling fans began to turn on and off by themselves. One of my mother's friends was an experienced painter, and he was left alone to paint the walls while my mom went for a food run. When she got back, she knocked on the door, but no one answered. She then texted him to let him know that she was outside waiting. Suddenly, she received a reply from him that just said, "You need to wait." My mom was taken back by the rude and abrupt message, but she figured that he may have been in the bathroom or something. After a couple of minutes, she knocked on the door again, and her friend eventually opened the door. When it came time to leave, she casually asked her friend if he didn't hear her when she was knocking on the door earlier. She also mentioned the text message that he had sent her. But the scariest part was he said he never sent a text message at all, and that he couldn't even hear her knocking because the music was blasting from his phone. This gave my mother the creeps. The next encounter happened right after the house was done being remodeled. My mother brought an acquaintance to help her clean up the house. They couldn't get the front door to open. They both pushed on the door as hard as they could when suddenly there came 3 knocks from the other side, and the door slowly opened by itself. They then searched the entire house, but no one was there. We found out from some neighbors that the family who lived there before didn't stay there very long either, because of a series of bizarre and unexplainable occurrences. After my mom and brother moved in, the supernatural events just worsened. There has been numerous attempts to deal with these restless spirits in the house, even inviting some local pastors over to bless the home. I was and am still worried about my brother. Whatever resides in that house has seemed to take a special interest in him, and he can hear his name being called out, beckoning to him. The other things that they have been experiencing are lights flickering on their own. Uncontrollable random knocking can be heard on the roof, and scratch marks have appeared on the walls. My mother has reached out to random people that can help, but nothing seems to work. She has now reached her breaking point and plans on moving out of that hell house. I just hope it's not too late for them. Their departure may trigger whatever's targeting my brother. It might just stop toying around with him and finally make its move.
The Haunted Room.
This happened in 2014, the year my daughter was born. It all began when we first moved into our house, which was built in the early 2000s. I was still pregnant at the time. While moving in, I noticed that the light in our daughter's room would be left on when many times we switched it off. I brushed it off as an accident or maybe an electrical problem until a few months later, after my daughter was born. We settled into our new home and made the room above the garage our hangout spot. One day, while my husband watched our 4-month-old daughter, he told me while he was in the rocking chair, he thought he saw me making my way to the garage really slow. He said he felt as if something was off. He called out my name, but he said I didn't turn around. He distinctively remembered seeing my dark brown hair. When he got up and went to the garage, there was no one there. He checked the upstairs hangout room, but again, no one was there. This really creeped us out, but somehow we were able to move past it. However, when our daughter had to have surgery 6 months later, our friend volunteered to house sit for us while we were in the hospital. He had been resting on the futon in the hangout room when he felt something aggressively hitting the futon mattress. Again, we never told him about our experiences in the house, but our heart sank when he messaged my husband asking us if our house was haunted. With everything going on with our daughter at the time, the last thing we wanted to hear was confirmation that our house was haunted. From that point on, whenever I was in the hangout room, I felt this unnerving sensation you get when you're being watched. I always had that feeling only when I was near that room. Sometimes I would be in the garage doing something and have a glance up to see the closet door in the hangout room cracked open, even though I vividly remember closing it. Small things like this may not sound too alarming or scary, but in the back of my mind, I knew that there was an unwelcomed presence in my house. I imagined that something was just behind that closet door staring right at me. We had to deal with that dark presence until the day we moved out of there. Thankfully, we haven't seen or felt anything ever since then.
A house in Texas.
Hi, my name is Jesse, and I have lived in Texas for most of my life until now. Growing up there wasn't exactly ideal, and I didn't have the best relationship with my parents either. I pretty much dreaded coming home from school every day. There were so many scary things going on at home. I'm going to share with you a series of strange events that happened to me when I was growing up. First of all, when I was about 6 years old, back then I used to play with the flashlight in the dark without a care in the world. However, on this night when I pointed my flashlight at the wall besides my bed, I saw something horrific. There was a shadow figure standing in the doorway. Naturally, I immediately pointed my light toward the figure, but the light was not able to illuminate it. At the time, I really didn't understand. As I lowered the flashlight, I could see the figure's rough outline. It seemed to have a dark outline. Just then, it suddenly started moving towards me. I was absolutely terrified. Seeing this thing as an adult would be terrifying. How much more as a kid? I didn't know how to process it. The last thing I remember doing was turning off the flashlight and running into my parents' room. I still don't know how I made it past the shadow of terror. Of course, my mom didn't believe me, and even as a kid, I knew that I couldn't go to my parents with stuff like this. A few years later, I was in middle school, and I was having a sleepover at my place with a friend. We went to the garage to grab some snacks and drinks after watching a movie. It was really late, so it was pretty dark. Once we entered, I sensed something was watching us. "I think we should get out of here," my friend said. My friend could also feel the unwelcomed presence. We quickly grabbed our stuff and were about to exit the garage when I pointed my flashlight near the mattresses that were leaning against the wall to the left. That's when we saw something quickly duck behind the mattresses to avoid the light. It was also that dark figure that I had saw before. We immediately shut the door and locked it. We then sat back down in the living room. We asked ourselves, what the hell did we just witness? I looked over to the clock and it was exactly 3:03 a.m. The last encounter was a week after my grandmother had passed away. She lived with us at the time. I remember that I went to the living room to use the computer and chat online. After a while, I heard a door open. I assumed that it was just my mom or dad using the bathroom. 15 minutes later, I got that strange feeling, the same feeling I felt the night my friend slept over. I got up and walked past the kitchen and dining room table and peeked into my grandmother's room, which was connected to the hallway. The door was slightly open. A dreadful feeling formed in the pit of my stomach. Something told me that if I didn't close that door, something scary would happen to me. So I quietly walked down the hallway to my grandmother's room. I was petrified as I quickly closed the door. I made it back to the living room where I stayed until the sun came back up. I'm so glad that I got out of that house, and I'm now living with my boyfriend. Who knows what else would have happened if I stayed there?
The woman in a white dress.
Hi, my name is Catherine, and this happened in 2012 in El Paso, Texas. When I was 20 years old, I was working as a supervisor at a store, and I got off of work late, around 3 o'clock a.m. I got into my car and I took the usual way home, which was down a dark, long, quiet back road that led all the way back to my house. Everything was going as usual until I spotted a figure. A figure walking in the distance. As I drove closer to it, it appeared to be a woman walking alongside the road dressed in all white. Upon seeing the woman, I got goosebumps going all the way down to my legs. Seeing the woman walking all by herself, I started to feel a little creeped out. At this point, I was really close to her, but I still had not seen her face yet. As I approached even closer, I got a better look at her since she was walking right beside the driver's window. She had long, black, messy hair that was blocking most of her face. She appeared to be barefoot. I was petrified. Then, as I drove exactly parallel to her, she turned towards me and I was finally able to see her face. There was no face, no mouth, or no eyes. It was just a pale face. I floored it, and the second I passed her, my worst nightmare came to life as the woman began running right beside my window. My heart was racing. I pressed down on the accelerator as much as I possibly could, but the terrifying woman kept pace with my car, never leaving the window. My mind could not process what was happening. I started praying out loud and tried my hardest not to look out the window or to pay attention to my peripheral vision. I didn't want to see her, although I could see that she was looking straight into my window. Eventually, the woman vanished from view. I then looked into my rearview mirror to see the white figure just standing there watching me until I was out of sight. I finally made it home sobbing and running into my husband's arms. I told him everything that happened, and to my surprise and horror, he said that he had once taken that same back road home one night and also saw a woman with long black hair wearing a white dress walking alongside the road, but for whatever reason, she didn't chase after him. I still have no idea who or what that woman is. I can only guess that it was a ghost of a woman that died alongside that dark road. What I do know is that I'm extremely lucky to have escaped her clutches. I never go down that road, and whoever happens to drive down that road at night alone, may God be with them.
The Lonely Drive.
So, my mother told me this story many years after it happened. To this day, I remember everything she said. My mother never lies, so I can assure you this is 100% true. My dad was a truck driver at the time. He would only drive around our home state of Texas, where we're from. And during the summertime, it was extremely busy for him. This happened in the late 1980s, and while he was on the road working in Texas, my mother said that when this happened, he was driving south on 77. He was getting pretty sleepy, and that's when he pulled his rig into the parking lot of a truck stop. He got off of his truck, and he started walking into the on-site convenience store when he noticed a young woman in her 20s. She looked really pretty and was wearing a tank top with shorts. She was also carrying something in her hands. After my father finished his business in the store, he headed back to his truck. But as he got in, he was shocked to see that the woman was sitting in the passenger seat of his truck. Again, he had no clue who this woman was or how she got past his locked door. My father never left the doors of his truck unlocked and was normally a secure person with most of his things. She just sat there staring at him, not saying a word. He wanted to walk over to the passenger side door, open it, pull her out, and leave, but for some reason he decided against it. So, my dad, against his better judgment, turned his rig on and drives off with the woman still in his passenger seat. After about 5 minutes of driving in silence, he decided to make a conversation with her. He asked her name, but again, she remained silent. As they continued down the highway, he then said that he was having lustful thoughts, and I'm sure it had been a while since he had last seen my mother. He must have thought, out there in the rural Texas roads, who would find out? That's when my father made a decision that will forever haunt him. He slowly placed his hand on her thigh, right above her knee. As soon as he touched her, the woman turned from a gorgeous young woman into some kind of monster. Her face became rugged, and her eyes were now black. A putrid stench then filled the inside of the rig. That's when this demonic creature let out a terrifying growl that sent chills through my father's body. My father quickly turned away from her and managed to bring his rig to a complete stop on the side of the road. As the truck came to a halt, my dad opened his door and jumped out of the truck. After taking a few minutes to compose himself and allow his breathing to return to normal, he looked back at his truck, and the demonic woman who was sitting in the passenger seat had completely vanished. He was now alone on the road. He began praying out loud, begging God to please rebuke the evil spirit. He eventually got into his truck and drove off. The woman never returned, however. It was a while before the lingering stench in the truck would go away. When my father got home from that trip, he was so scared that my mother would not forgive him for his unfaithful decision. He told her everything and blamed himself for having impure thoughts, and perhaps that's why he attracted the evil spirit in the first place. I know many might say that people cheat on their partners all the time, and nothing like this ever happened to them. I can't explain why. I only know what happened to my father on that dark, lonely road in Texas. When I was older, I was very curious and brought it up to my father. I asked him, "Did that really happen to you?" He didn't say a word. He just nodded his head up and down.
The Beast.
I'll start off by saying that I've always believed in the paranormal. The paranormal encounter that I'm about to tell you was unlike anything that I've ever experienced in my entire life. It was the summer of 2010. My nephew, who was around the same age as me, along with my friends Tim and John, were all hanging out at my house for a sleepover. We were watching the movie The Exorcist, and it was around 2 o'clock in the morning. When the movie was done, I told everybody that I was too tired to stay up any longer, and I was going to crash out in the living room. After grabbing a pillow and blanket from my bedroom, I proceeded to turn off all the lights and lay on the couch. After about a minute or two, I fell asleep. I then woke up and all the lights were on in the living room, and I asked if anyone was there. I couldn't go back to sleep with all the lights on, so I got up and looked around. What I confronted that night still gives me chills and petrifies me to this day. A dark, malevolent presence revealed itself to me. It seemed to have a half-goat, half-human appearance. The lower half was a goat body, while the middle was a human body with a goat head. Now this is where things get really scary for me. I speak, read, and write Assyrian, which is a modern-day form of ancient Aramaic, spoken by the Jews in Jesus' day. It began speaking to me in ancient Aramaic. I knew enough to recognize the dialect, but I couldn't understand what it was saying to me. The thing then pointed to my room down the hall. I began making my way towards my bedroom door. It was as if I was in a trance. When I got to my room, I opened the door. At first I saw nothing but red. Eventually, a vision of my nephew's dead corpse appeared to me. In my shock and horror, I screamed a curse word in ancient Aramaic, and to this day, I don't know what it meant, or how I was able to say it. But within seconds, I woke up in the kitchen, and all the lights were off. I was gripping a sharp object tightly in my hand. I ran into my bedroom yelling hysterically, waking up all my friends and my mother who was down the hall. After explaining to everyone what I had saw, I started shaking and crying like a frightened child. My mother, who was a deeply religious person, blessed the home after she heard my experience. I had lucid dreams before, but nothing to this extent of what happened that dark night.
The roof entity.
Most of my life, I've grown up on farms up in Tennessee or living in the middle of nowhere. We were accustomed to not having access to the internet or TV, and even cell phones. I like to think of my family as the last true generation before the internet age. But honestly, it wasn't really all that bad outside of the long, boring summer days where we would be practically cooked alive out in the fields. We lived in an old Civil War cabin in the middle of nowhere in Tennessee, and it definitely produced some pretty interesting experiences. This story starts off like many normal days. It was a typical Friday night. My brothers and I were home alone, and seeing how there wasn't much to entertain us, we began playing Manhunt. Most of the time, we wanted to stay indoors as it was pitch black outside. For a bit more context, our cabin was situated on top of a steep hill that had a long winding driveway running down it. Our cabin also had a basement level. The main level was where most of the house was, and the upstairs only had my room. We also had a back deck that was elevated about 12 feet in the air, so it was really pitch black outside, and going out further than our front porch at night wasn't really something we normally did. But with what little room that we had to play with at this point, I had the bright idea to wander outside and hide on the roof to make the game more interesting. This was one of the biggest regrets in my life. At first, everything seemed fine. It was rather cold out that night, as it was nearing fall, and the weather was just starting to change. There was a slight breeze in the air. See, after a few minutes of just sitting up there on the roof, I felt that something was off. I had been practically mesmerized by the sound of crickets and other insects when I realized that all of a sudden the noises suddenly and completely stopped. This seemed very odd to me, being as naive as I was at the time. I didn't realize that this only meant something bad was going to happen. I didn't seem to hear anything aside from the slight breeze from the leaves. Then, as quickly as a silence came, an eruption of noise came from the other end of the roof. For a bit more detail, we had a metal roof at the time, making it very easy to hear when things would hit it. It sounded like something had landed on the opposite side of the roof. I looked over, but I couldn't see anything. This, of course, left me rather unnerved. My first thought was to get down from the roof before going into a full-blown panic. I remember it couldn't possibly be my brothers messing with me. They would have given up looking for me by now. I opened up the window to my bedroom and called for my brothers. They both ran up the stairs, shouting and complaining that the roof was off limits. When my oldest brother got to me, I asked him if they had been messing with me while I was on the roof. He, of course, denied this and wanted to come and investigate. So he and I slowly made our way to the middle of the roof. Everything went quiet around us once again. At this point, I was already on edge. We heard what sounded like pounding at the far end of the roof in the opposite direction of where we were standing. After what I think was about 3 sets of 6 pounding noises, it suddenly charged us. At least I think it did. It sounded like a pair of hooves stomping on the metal roof. But the only issue was we couldn't see anything. Aside from us, the entire roof was clear, but somehow we could hear these stomping footsteps. It quickly began running circles around us. I held my arms out to try and see if I could feel anything, but I couldn't. And the strangest part of all was that we could feel the vibration of the footsteps all around us, but we could not feel anything in the air. The entity circled us for what seemed like many minutes, but was probably no more than 60 seconds. It suddenly stopped circling us, and we could hear the steps trail off the roof and disappear. We quickly ran back inside and locked all the windows and doors. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, freaked out as hell.
My mom's doppelganger.
I have an open mind, but I don't buy into things that easily. Most things that happen, I blame on my mind. Playing tricks on me, or sleep deprivation, or simply the fact that it could be a mental illness. There is one moment though, or I suppose a few moments, that have been on my mind for some time now. While I was in the shower one day, and as water poured over my head, I heard my brother yell my name. Stacy. Stacy. The second time was louder than the first, as if something was wrong. I could have sworn I heard my dog barking as well at the same time. Annoyed but concerned, I got out and cracked the door open, then called back to him, but after waiting a few seconds there was no response. I quickly dried myself off and put on my robe, then headed downstairs asking what he needed. However, I still got no response. My dog was on her bed, fast asleep, and my brother was nowhere to be found. I looked out the window, and their car wasn't even there. This wasn't the first time my mind has decided to play these annoying games, so I didn't really think much of it. I've had auditory hallucinations before, none to that degree, but maybe they're getting worse, I thought. That's my way of trying to reason with myself, and it worked. The next time that I heard my brother yell my name calling for me loudly, I thought I was genuinely going crazy. I decided to bring it up to my brother while playing Borderlands one night. We talked about our mental health a lot because our parents don't believe in therapy, so we kind of became each other's safe haven. I explained everything that's happened over the past month, and instead of giving advice or sympathizing like he usually does, he just gets really quiet for a second until he says that he's been having the same experiences as me. Except it's been our mom yelling his name, but she's never even home when it happens. He goes to check and no one's there. This was about a month ago or two, but he also thought his mind was playing tricks on him. It seemed after that talk, things began to stop. I didn't hear anything for almost 3 weeks, but then something happened that I'll never forget to this very day, and I will probably never have an explanation for what it was. I was sitting in my bed, in my room, scrolling through Instagram, when my mom starts aggressively calling my name from downstairs. I've never heard her voice before. It was always my brother's, so I didn't even think anything weird of it. I was about to get up and see what she wanted, when suddenly my mom burst through the door asking me what I wanted. I didn't know what to say, but I could tell that she was annoyed by the look she gave me. She asked me again what I wanted, and I just shook my head trying to understand what was going on. Then she angrily sighed and said not to yell her name while she's making dinner, and she walked out, leaving the door open. Still in shock, I got up to close the door, but as I walked across the room, my heart stopped when I came to the realization, and I immediately ran over to the window and looked at my driveway. My mom was at work, and the car wasn't even there. I locked my door to my room and jumped on my bed. Again, there was banging on my door. I sat on my bed crying as I called my brother. I was absolutely petrified and wanted to get out of the house, but couldn't even get myself to go downstairs alone, knowing that whatever that thing was out there. My brother didn't pick up as he was at work, so I was left stuck there. I ended up locking myself in my small bathroom while I waited for either my brother or my mom to get home from work, though I knew it would be hours. Thankfully, nothing else happened until my mom got back home. I told my brother that night, and he said he never had anything like that happen to him that bad. To this day, I still have no answers as to what I was hearing and seeing, but honestly, I'm writing this and sharing it to everyone just to be able to forget about it and move on.
Scary, true, paranormal story number 2, my childhood home.
This occurred when I was about 8 years old. My childhood home had a lot of issues with its past. A lot of deaths happened in the house prior to my family moving in. Most recently, the people that were renting it out to my mom and stepdad didn't want to live there because their son decided to opt out of life. And before that, a few murders even happened at the house. We didn't know the details, but that's what the landlord told us. I was young when my mom met my stepdad, and shortly after they met, they moved in together. My paranormal experiences didn't come until my baby sister came along, and that's when everything started. The house had 2 bedrooms, so I had to share a room with my baby sister, Rye. My little sister would never stop crying, and when I was young, I absolutely could not stand her. I remember this one night that I will never forget. She was crying for hours, and all of a sudden, she completely stopped. The room was dark, but I had a nightlight, so I could see a little around the room. I looked over, and I saw this shadowy figure hovering over her crib. It didn't move much, but when it did, it was slow and misty. I was petrified and hid under the covers until I eventually fell asleep. I told my parents the next day. They thought it was just my imagination. This happened so many more times of just waking up and seeing the figure by my sister's crib. It was nowhere else in the room. After a while of complaining about it, I ended up sleeping in my parents' room with my mom, while my stepdad slept in my room, but a lot more continued to happen. Shortly after I started seeing this figure, my stepdad lost his job. He was a hardworking man, so it really shocked my mom when it happened. He went through a rough depression because he really loved his job, and losing it must have been really hard on him. I remember him sitting on the couch all day, every day, just watching TV. One day, when I got home from school, I came in and saw him sitting on the couch, and a dark figure was standing right behind him. I remember it so clearly, just standing behind the couch. I didn't know what to do, so I just began to cry. My stepdad got up really quick and took me to the room to calm me down. When my mom came home, I told my parents that night of what I saw. Again, my stepdad seemed disinterested, but my mom seemed a little sympathetic. But No one really believed me. After that, there were a few good weeks where nothing happened, followed by weeks of this figure hanging around, usually either by Rye or my stepdad. Some nights, when I slept in my room, I'd hear a voice. It was a woman's voice. It was real deep, just talking to Rye. I never understood the words coming from it, but it terrified me every time. As Rye got older and began to walk and talk, I noticed she spent a lot more time in that room talking to her so-called friend, the Dark Shadow. I knew what it was. The more this figure seemed to hang around, the worse the emotions in the house got. My sister would seem to never talk to anyone else. My mom had so much anger inside of her, and my stepdad was always depressed, and I was alone all the time. Then my parents started fighting all the time, screaming things at each other. My mom hated my stepdad for not keeping down a job, and my stepdad was just a depressed mess. They seemed to fight every single night, and every night it got worse. While in my room, I even heard my stepdad telling my mom to put the knife down. But the worst time of all was when I was in the living room watching TV. It wasn't that late, maybe 8:30 p.m. or so, and my stepdad was asleep on the couch while my mom was in her room. I was starting to get tired, and I turned off the TV and walked upstairs to my room. At the top of the stairs, though, I started to hear whispering, followed by speaking back to the whispers. The door was cracked open a few inches, and I slowly walked over to look inside. Just a couple of steps away from the door, I walked over to the door, and I looked inside, and that's when I saw a figure, and that's when I could see Rye next to this figure, as if it was trying to lead her somewhere. I screamed, and instantly the door slammed by itself. I just stood there screaming and crying before my mom rushed out of the room. I just pointed at the door, unable to make out any words. She tried to open it, but it was locked. It was one of those cheaper ones, though, where she could use her fingernail to open it. She pushed it open, and Rye was in the corner of the room facing the wall. My mom yelled at her for locking the door, even though Rye was way too short to reach the doorknob. Rye didn't have any sort of reaction on her face. After that, I fell into a small depression, along with what seemed like the rest of the family. No one talked to each other. I became the one taking care of my baby sister. Me and the strange figure I became familiar with. It even started hanging around my bed during nights when I was extra sad, and it brought me a sort of weird comfort, knowing that I wasn't alone. Eventually, my mom had enough of my dad, and we left to stay with my grandparents. I remember her telling us to pack up, and as we headed to the car, I saw the figure again, standing right behind my dad. I felt sad leaving him, but at least he wouldn't truly be alone.